Welcome to episode 6 of Back to the Roots podcast. I'm Brian Wood, and in this episode, Mike Klein and myself sit down with John Kempf, who is the founder of Advancing Eco-Agriculture. John is a really interesting and smart guy, and we had a good conversation about his findings and observations over the years in plant nutrition, and also went over some of his views on where he thinks agriculture is heading in the coming years. We really hope you enjoy this conversation. I know we did. Thanks a lot.
Today, myself, Mike Klein, and Brian Wood are sitting down with John Kempf from Advancing Eco-Agriculture. So, John, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you give us a little bit of a history and your earlier years in getting Advancing Eco-Agriculture started?
Well, I grew up on an Amish fruit and vegetable farm in northeast Ohio in the snow belt south of Lake Erie in the Middlefield, Ohio region, which is about 30 miles or so east of Cleveland. And my dad started growing vegetables in 1994. We were producing wholesale fresh market, primarily fresh market vegetables such as tomatoes and peppers, green beans, cucumbers, zucchini, cantaloupe, etc. We were very conventional, very mainstream, using very intense pesticide applications to control diseases and insects. And in the early 2000s, we had a 3-year period, 2002, 3, and 4, in which we lost greater than 70% of the various crops that we were growing to a variety of different diseases and insects that we were unsuccessful in controlling with pesticide applications. In the third year of that 3-year period, 2004, we had a really fascinating experience where we had this very long, narrow field that bordered right up against a neighboring field. And in 2004, we began renting this neighboring field. So what used to be 2 very long, narrow strips that were being tilled up and down the slopes, we started farming together as one field and planting crops directly across the field border. And in 2004, we planted that crop into field into cantaloupe. And on the old soil that we had been farming for the last number of years, at harvest time, 80% of the leaves were infected with powdery mildew. And on the new soil, there was no powdery mildew. You couldn't find any. It was so pronounced. There was a knife line right down through the center of the field. In fact, there were healthy vines growing right in amongst the unhealthy vines. And I wanted to know what really is the difference between these two plants and what allows one plant to be resistant to powdery mildew when the next plant 2 feet away is susceptible. And it was really trying to find the answer to that question that led to the work that we're doing today.
What was in that field before you started renting it? What was that, just in regular crop rotation, or what was that being used for?
The new field that we started renting was in an Amish dairy farm rotation, so it was corn, small grains, alfalfa. Mm-hmm. Basically a 4-year rotation, 2 years hay, 1 year corn, 1 year small grains, and then into hay. Mm-hmm. So the substantial difference between that field and the fields that we've been farming for the prior decade were that there was a substantial difference in pesticide exposure. The soil type was very much the same. Mineral balance was very similar, but the soil that we've been growing vegetables on was getting intense annual applications of pesticides that accumulated over time and resulted in a substantial loss in soil biology, microbiology, which greatly reduced the vigor and the health of the crops that we were growing on those fields.
So that got you looking into what is going on here.
Yeah, I really wanted to know what are the differences between these two plants and how can we replicate this? Because obviously having 3 years of severe losses was intensely frustrating. And so what I learned, I spent a lot of time on the phone and at the library researching, studying, calling as many people as I could, trying to find an answer to that question. And what I learned from a number of different people is that plants have an immune system exactly the same way that we do. We know that all of us have our own immune systems, but they don't all work equally well. Some people succumb to the first cold or flu bug that comes along, and other people practically never become ill. And the only difference between those two is how well their immune system has been supported with nutrition over the course of that plant's entire lifetime, not just in the last 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months, but from even before they were born. And the same holds true of plants as well.
That's something I think that a lot of people are not aware of, is the immune system in a plant, and how the pesticide applications will knock down the immune system of that plant. Even though it's designed to kill the bugs, so the bugs don't kill the plant, yet it still knocks down that plant.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something. This is research science that was first done in the 50s and 60s and was popularized in a book titled Healthy Crops by Francis Schiboso, where he clearly described how pesticide applications, he called this, his words were trophobiosis, or understanding the difference between protein synthesis and proteolysis. And what he described was that when you apply a pesticide onto a plant, it actually suppresses that plant's immune system, in some cases very substantially, and actually increases disease and insect susceptibility. So it's very similar to our own systems. If we take drugs, there are a number of drugs that we take that really suppress our own immune system. And the same thing happens for plants as well. So in reality, what we experienced and learned is that the more pesticides you use, the more pesticides you are forced to use, because you create a self-perpetuating cycle.
Did you see when you learned, or you were doing this research, was there something that you read or talked to somebody that just blew your mind and really got you excited about it?
Well, there were several pieces that happened. So from the experience that we had on the farm in the early 2000s, and from the things that I had learned, we started doing a lot of experimentation with nutrition. Okay, if it's possible, and all the research indicated that it was, if it is really possible to produce plants that are resistant to diseases and insects by managing nutrition, then let's do that. Let's not just have it be a theory that sounds great on paper, but let's actually do it in the field. So in 2005, 2006, and the latter part of 2004, we did a lot of experimentation with plant nutrition. And of course, growing fruit and vegetable crops, we have drip irrigation and foliar applications where we can customize and fine-tune weekly or several times a week nutrient applications to try to correct what is going on. And then we were very successful on the farm. By 2006, we went completely pesticide-free. And from the success that we had on our own farm, I started working with other growers, doing consulting work. It was really the beginnings of Advancing Eco-Agriculture. I founded Advancing Eco-Agriculture as a consulting company in 2006 to work with other fruit and vegetable growers to help them achieve these same results that we were achieving. And over the next number of years, it's now been 11 years since we started that, and there were a couple of pieces that happened that I became really excited about. The first was the realization that plants, when we talk about plant immunity, there are a couple of immune pathways, and plants produce these immune compounds, such as phenolic compounds, bioflavonoids, terpenoids. These are all aromatic compounds that plants produce as the foundation of their own immune system. So, in plain English, we call them essential oils. And some of these compounds are very well known, such as anthocyanins in blueberries, resveratrol in red wine, lycopene in tomatoes. These are compounds that are known. They are not just a part of the a plant's immune system, but they also enhance our own immune systems. And what we observed is that when plants become really healthy, the concentrations of these immune compounds increases by multiple orders of magnitude. So take anthocyanins in blueberries, for example. Michigan State University in 1992 conducted a research trial in which they indicated that the anthocyanin content of blueberries can vary just based on variety and environment. They didn't even take nutrition into consideration. Just based on variety and environment can vary by a factor of 25x. That's a huge variable. And so what I realized is that when we grow really healthy plants with functional immune systems and they're resistant to diseases and insects, we get much higher concentrations of these immune compounds, and we can truly have a conversation about growing food as medicine, because this food will really enhance our own immune system. So that, to me, was really exciting. But then we observed something else. which was that when we grow plants that have this level of health and immunity and vigor and pest resistance, they also begin sequestering carbon and building soil organic matter at rates that are almost unheard of. So within agriculture, we have adopted this paradigm that the simple process of growing crops is by its very nature somehow extractive, that we are extracting organic matter, that we are extracting nutrients, and we constantly need to replenish that. And what we have observed is that this is often true because of the approach and the management style that we use, but it doesn't need to be true. It's not inherently true. Every single crop has the capacity to build organic matter and sequester carbon much greater in volume than the crop that we actually remove. And there's been a lot of study around this. When we look at carbon sequestration, there are 3 ecosystems that sequester carbon faster than all others. The first is an early growth stage coniferous forest when it's growing very quickly. The second is perennial polyculture grazing, where we have intensively managed, truly well-managed, intensively managed rotational grazing on perennial polycultures. And the third is growing corn. Corn has the capacity to sequester carbon and build soil organic matter faster than almost any other crop. So we have developed this idea that somehow growing corn, growing soybeans, growing these other plants and crops is going to deplete soils. And that is often true because of the way we manage it, but it doesn't need to be true. We actually have experience on a number of farms. One organic grower that we've been working with in Kansas for the last 3 years has built soil organic matter an average of 0.5 percentage point per year growing organic corn on corn on corn.
Okay, that seems like that just doesn't seem right from everything that you've seen and heard forever.
Exactly.
The corn is, people are going away from raising corn because it's depleting the soil too much.
Yeah,
this is exciting.
It's what we have come to accept as normal, as common, is crops that are photosynthesizing at only about 15 to 20%. Sometimes on the high side as much as 25% of their inherent photosynthetic capacity in every 24-hour photo period. So imagine what happens if you're growing a corn crop and you move that number from 20% to, let's say, 80%. You've quadrupled the number of sugars that plant is producing in every 24-hour photo period. Well, you and I both know that is not going to translate into a quadrupling of yield. You might get a nice yield response, 5%, 10% at the very best, 15 to 20%. So the most extreme that we have ever seen, was in 1 year, was a 70% yield difference. That's extraordinary. That doesn't happen very often. But 10% is not unreasonable. 15% is not unreasonable. But so what happens with all the rest of the sugar production when you go from 20% to 80%? Well, it goes downstairs, down to the root system, out through the roots as root exudates. When we look at these reproductive crops, these grain crops such as corn, soybeans, etc., the total sugar production over this plant's entire lifetime, from the moment the seed is planted until the crop is finally harvested, that total sugar production on a really healthy plant, this doesn't often happen, but on a really healthy plant, is going to be split into 4 almost exactly equal pieces. 25% goes into the fruit or the grain, 25% goes into plant biomass above the soil surface. Then the remaining 50%, 25% goes into root biomass below the soil, and the other 25% goes out through the roots as root exudates to feed soil biology. Now, in our observation, that only happens, that split, 50% above the soil, 50% below the soil, only happens when crops cross the threshold of somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60% photosynthetic efficiency. Most plants today are at 20 to 25%. They're never going to get there. And as a result, the ratio looks very different because a plant's number one desire is to reproduce. And so as a result of being at 20% instead of 80%, you end up with a corn crop, for example, on which I'm just making up numbers here, but let's say 40% goes into the grain, 30% goes into the plant biomass above the soil, And that gives you a combined 70%, and the remaining 30% goes into root biomass below the soil surface, which leaves you very little for root exudates and for larger root biomass. So the reality is that we can build soil organic matter while we are growing corn, while we're growing soybeans, while we're growing oats, while we are growing tomatoes, while we're growing strawberries. This idea that we need to deplete soil organic matter while we're growing a crop is not supported by the evidence. And so the things that, the really long answer to your question, but over the last number of years, the things that I've been really excited about are I see that there is the potential for us to grow crops that are resistant to diseases and insects, that truly provide food as medicine and are exceptional quality for the people who consume that food, and thirdly, who actually build soil organic matter and regenerate an ecosystem while we are growing a crop. And this, to me, is incredibly exciting because it gives us the foundation for a truly regenerative agriculture ecosystem where we can grow really healthy food and regenerate agriculture and soil at the same time. That, to me, is incredibly empowering and inspiring.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, because I think sometimes, especially, conventional mindset people are transitioning to organics. They want to try to build soil and make a living on it, and they don't think they can do both. They think, well, they've got to, plow downs and cover crops and all that, and basically not make anything, no crop off of it. Well, especially with the price of land in most areas, you've got to be profitable while you build your soil, or you won't survive. So this is exciting, especially the guys that raise a lot of corn silage. They're going to love this.
No, and you just mentioned a very key point. Advancing Eco-Agriculture as a company has grown extremely rapidly for the last 5 to 6 years. And since we started doing our own product manufacturing and put our own products in the marketplace in 2012. And the reason for that is because I personally am very passionate about the potential of these regenerative agriculture systems. And I want these nutritional models, these paradigms, to become the mainstream, to become the status quo around the world. I want them to completely displace what is the current status quo. And I realize that in order for that to be true, we cannot have a conversation with growers and farmers about growing food as medicine and about building soil organic matter and regenerating soil health. They don't care. Commercial production agriculture doesn't care. They're in a position where they're almost forced, unfortunately, because of economics, they're forced in a position where they can't care. It feels good, and they might be inspired to try something, but it is absolutely imperative. If we want this to expand, it must make economic sense. And so what we have focused on as a company very intensely is making absolutely certain that every single time we work with a grower and we begin implementing these regenerative agriculture systems and the nutritional management systems that support this and allow this to become true, we must show a very strong economic return. This becomes purely economics. The reality is you achieve what you incentivize. And when you can demonstrate to a grower that you can make more money and be more profitable using these nutritional management systems than what you've been using in the past, the conversation is over. Mm-hmm. We can move forward on that.
Well, I guess I want to kind of tie it all together. You mentioned making economic sense. I think the key, telling the whole story of how regenerative agriculture, once you get to that point, it can be more profitable. But I think the key there is how long does it take to get to that point? Now, you mentioned in 2004 you saw the on the rented ground, and then by 2006 you were implementing some of these policies. So in those 3 years on that ground that was applied, you had applied pesticides. What kind of responses year over year were you seeing in rebuilding the immune system, I guess, of those plants?
So there's 2 parts to the answer to that question. So first, in the work that we are doing today and what we have learned in 2004, 2005, and all the way up until for the last 12 years is What we have learned today, and what we make certain of today, is we want to see an economic response with the first application. If a farmer is growing wheat or oats or corn or soybeans or dry beans or whatever the case might be, and he decides to put on one foliar application, that foliar application has to deliver an economic response. If it costs $20 per acre, it needs to return $40 or $60 an acre or more. And we've been able to do that very consistently. In addition to that, the second part of the answer is that there absolutely are compounding returns. It's like compound interest. Once you start the flywheel moving in one direction and you start rebuilding soil health, rebuilding plant health, then the farther you go, the faster you go. And it's you start building up momentum where the soil becomes healthier and healthier, and it starts growing healthier and healthier plants.
Now, when you talk about different crops, probably the vegetable crop that with drip irrigation that you can monitor on a day-to-day basis is probably a lot easier to get a response quicker than, say, a field where you're pasturing. It's harder to see the returns on the pasture than it is the vegetable crop. But as far as from your perspective, there's no difference in getting a return on it?
So every crop, of course, has different economics. And with the economics of some crops, it's difficult to make anything pay off, like with commodity corn today, at the moment, for example. But in general, first of all, you mentioned something that I believe is very important. We absolutely cannot rely on what we see. Visual metrics are not good enough. You have to measure. And you also have to ask the question is, what is it that you should really be measuring? For example, on a dairy farm, I'm of the persuasion that it is not an appropriate metric to measure milk production per cow. Instead, you should be measuring milk production per acre. And when you start measuring milk production per acre, or even better, if you want to start measuring components, think of it in terms of butterfat per acre. And all of a sudden, you see butterfat per acre tied directly to profitability in ways that milk production per cow never does. So you have to ask yourself, you have to measure the right parameters, and you actually do have to measure it. Just looking at it visually is never good enough. So then, where are the crops that we see responses? Well, the crops where we see responses and consistent responses very quickly are two types. So when we look at plant physiology and plant nutrition, we group crops in general into three different groups. And two out of those three groups are very easy to get results on, and the third is more challenging. So the first group would be what we would term vegetative crops. So vegetative crops are lettuce, spinach, kale, alfalfa, perennial grasses, etc. Those are vegetative crops in which we are going purely for vegetative biomass. And these crops are very interesting because achieving a yield response is not limited by the plant's genetic reproductive potential. So it's very simple that when I talked about the corn example earlier, when you quadruple the photosynthesis, you don't quadruple the yield. That's because that's a reproductive crop and has a genetic limit. That genetic limit doesn't exist for lettuce or kale or spinach or alfalfa. If you quadruple the photosynthesis of an alfalfa plant, it's going to be quite probable you're going to quadruple the biomass production as well. So you can get substantial yield responses on these vegetative crops. The second type of crop is what we refer to as a multiple fruiting crop. So these are crops that blossom and bloom and reproduce over an extended period. Examples would be cucumbers or tomatoes or soybeans. So soybeans bloom and blossom over an extended period. And because of that extended period, you can work with nutrition to substantially increase the number of pods, the number of beans, the number of tomatoes, the number of cucumbers on a plant. The third type of crop is what we would refer to as single fruiting crops, where you have all the blossoming and pollination happening in one condensed time period, like oats or wheat or corn. So in all these grains where you have a very condensed reproductive window, it is much more difficult to get a substantial yield response. You might get a 5%, 10%, 15% yield response, but it's going to be very unusual to get a 20 to 30% yield response. It can happen. It does happen occasionally, but not consistently. With soybeans, getting a 20% yield improvement is not that much of a challenge. It happens routinely. So then, of course, you have to look at the potential yield responses that you can achieve and what it costs to achieve that and what the economics of the crop are. And in general, those single fruiting crops, unless there are quality components, if you're being paid for quality, like on wheat, if you're being paid for protein content, for example, now there is a substantial economic return because you can make a couple percentage point increase in protein content without too much of a challenge. So whenever you can get paid for components, you can make an economic difference. But if it's purely on bushels, it's a lot harder to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. Now, are there, like take wheat for example, are there times of influence when you can hit it with a foliar crop to change that protein? Is that when you're doing that?
Yes.
At very critical stages with small windows?
Absolutely. We developed this concept called critical points of influence, and particularly on the grain crops. On the other crops, the multiple fruiting crops, the vegetative crops, you have a broader window. The windows are not as narrow, they're not as clearly defined. But particularly on these small grain crops and corn, you have very defined periods where that plant's reproductive potential is being determined, and putting on foliar applications of nutrients in these specific windows can produce a tremendous response. And if you miss the window by 24 hours, you can reduce the response by 50% or more.
Wow. Do you have, where do you go to learn where these stages are? Do you as consultants, if let's say I'm working with your company, would they come out and tell me, hey, this needs to be hit tomorrow?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Every single recommendation that we make, when we put nutritional recommendations together at the beginning of a growing season for a grower, we will say this specific foliar application needs to be applied on soybeans right between the third and the fourth trifoliate. We have very specific growth stages, and we know that and we clearly define and describe what those are. And if we miss those growth stages, the results are going to go down dramatically.
Because like you said earlier, economic return.
Oh,
because a farmer, if he's spending the money to do it,
yeah,
and he's missing that window, he's not going to get the return. So
absolutely.
And I think especially, I work primarily with dairy farmers, and there are more and more farmers looking at income per acre and not the income per cow, because the guy that's milking 30 cows on 150 acres, wow, he's got a lot of net profits per cow. Well, what about the 150 acres that you're farming? And we're seeing more and more guys that are religious in their foliar applications are now seeing a yield increase, yes, but they're seeing a quality return on their feed that is making way more milk. They're helping their components. So, some people think, well, I'm just going to spray it one time and that's going to be it and it's going to fix everything. Well, you're not putting urea on it. You're not going to see that greening right behind your sprayer. So it's more of a process than the conventional mindset.
Well, I think that in agriculture, historically, we have completely missed the boat in our single biggest opportunity to radically improve plant performance in the field. Imagine, I'm just making up an analogy right here on the fly, but imagine you were running a shop with a diesel engine on it, and as a power source, and this engine is running and is supplying 15 to 20 horsepower, which is all you really need. You want to really scale up your productivity, scale up the horsepower. And you learn that the only thing you have to do is you have to adjust the carburetor in this one specific way, and you have to stay on top of it and manage it every couple of days or couple of weeks. And you stay on top of that, and instead of getting 20 horsepower, you can get 80 horsepower. Who would not do that?
No kidding.
Who would not do that? And when we have this conversation about foliars, foliar applications are the equivalent of this diesel engine. And or they're the equivalent of the carburetor on the diesel engine. The plant's photosynthesis is the diesel engine. Photosynthesis and growing really healthy plants is the one and only way we have as farmers of bringing new energy into an ecosystem. And we have had this idea in agriculture that it takes healthy soil to grow healthy plants, without considering the possibility that healthy plants actually regenerate and create healthy soil. So when you start talking about photosynthesis, carbon sequestration, sugar production, I look at plants and photosynthesis as our way of hacking the system. When we can hack photosynthesis and quadruple the sugar production every 24-hour photo period for the cost of a foliar application that costs $25 or $30 per acre, there is absolutely nothing else that we can do that economically competes with that on a farm. When you look at, let's take an alfalfa crop, for example. Actually, we have some interesting data on this. It is reasonable to expect with 2 or 3 foliar applications that cost $35 per acre. So let's say 3 of them for $35 an acre. That's $105 per acre total. It's reasonable to increase the alfalfa production on a field by a factor of about 30%, pretty consistently. So you think about that increased production of 30%, and that's a little bit better than break-even ROI. You get about 1.5 to 2x ROI on that. But what that doesn't take into consideration is what happened in it with that soil. For all that biomass that you produced, all the additional biomass you produced, since alfalfa is a vegetative crop and not a reproductive crop, that means the sugar split between biomass above the ground and biomass below the ground is 50-50, because there's no grain to take into consideration. So now, all that increased yield that you've taken off the top is also represented by increased organic matter in the soil surface. So let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that represents an additional 2 tons per acre. Well, how much would it cost you to put on 2 tons per acre of compost? How much would it cost you to plant a cover crop and grow 2 tons per acre of biomass in the cover crop? How much would it cost you to put on 2 tons per acre of sugar equivalent in the form of molasses or something like that? You cannot economically compete with the engine that is photosynthesis if you simply prime the pump and let it run. That's the perfect way to hack the system.
Because you're harvesting sunlight.
It's free energy.
Yeah.
It's completely free energy.
You see all these solar panels going up, but farmers aren't using their fields to do the same thing.
Exactly.
Well, and it's the one thing I definitely have seen is that the folks that are almost being forced to look at hacking the system or improving what they're getting off their current acreage is where acreage is really expensive.
Exactly.
And it's really frustrating working with people that are in areas that, Mike mentioned the 150 acres, 30 cows, they're producing plenty of feed in most cases for their cows, so they don't look at doing this kind of stuff. It's frustrating. Are you seeing the same thing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the areas with the highest land prices are the areas where AEA has the most business.
Because you've got to maximize your yields and your quality of product per acre. If your land's $30,000 an acre and you're getting 4 ton of hay per acre, that's
broke.
not going to pencil.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's one thing that we started within Organic Valley is we started the grass milk, 100% grass milk. And as a part of that, the farmer gets a return of $1 per hundredweight reimbursement towards soil inputs. So if they don't use the dollar, they don't get the dollar. So we've seen that really incentivize people to use it, and the most successful people in my region are religiously foliaring their pastures and their hayfields.
Absolutely.
And they are seeing that the cows will rather eat that high quality forage than they will eat, corn silage. And they're seeing it, but it's not ringing the bell of everybody yet.
Well, we've been told, I say we, the organic dairies and the grazing dairy movement has been told for a really long time that the key to economic success is low inputs. Well, that only works, and we don't need to get into a conversation about economics, but the low input model only works when you have low capital costs, specifically low land prices. When you have high land prices, high capex costs, the low input model is no longer sustainable. You now have to have a maximum efficiency model, which is not on the same page as the low input model. So it's a fundamental paradigm shift, and many people who have been very successful in doing this for a long period of time haven't been as open to changing that, which is to be expected. But I believe that this is the direction that the organic and the grazing dairy movement is going to go in. Absolutely.
I think it goes back to the old saying of it takes money to make money. You got to spend money to make money. But I want to go back to, I guess my head was spinning a little bit at the time, the increasing the efficiency of photosynthesis. You mentioned 20% is typically what a conventional farm or a typical farm might run at now, but you're looking at 50, 60, 70%. You might have mentioned it earlier, but I'm just trying to clarify a little bit. How can you go from 20% to that 60%, increase that efficiency?
Yep. So when you look at the photosynthesis process as a biochemical process, biochemical pathway, you cannot speed up the speed with which that pathway moves. But what you can do is you can substantially increase the volume of those pathways inside a leaf. So, for example, increasing leaf thickness so that you have more chlorophyll in the leaf, increasing leaf width of every individual leaf, increasing the concentration of chlorophyll and chloroplasts within each cell. All of those things combine to give you a much greater photosynthetic activity. So, I can give you the short list of the nutrients. There are 5 specific nutrients that we look at very specifically to help us accomplish these results that contribute to all of these various pieces. And we believe these 5 nutrients need to be addressed with every foliar spray. Not necessarily that they need to be included with every foliar spray, but we need to make sure the plant has an adequate supply every time we go out to the field. The first of the 5 is magnesium, because it's the center ion of the chlorophyll molecule. The second is iron, because it is the pipe wrench that puts chlorophyll together. So there are 3 nutrients which turn a plant and a field dark green: nitrogen, magnesium, and iron. Everybody knows nitrogen, but magnesium and iron do the exact same thing, and the reason they produce that effect is because they substantially increase the chlorophyll concentrations in the leaf. Then, so nitrogen also may need to be addressed sometimes in some organic farms, but in particular. But for the most part, we often don't see nitrogen as being the biggest limiting factor. Then, in addition, we also need to address manganese. Manganese, because in the photosynthesis process, the plant absorbs water from the soil, carbon dioxide from the air, and combines them to form sugar. The first step in that process is to split the water molecule, H2O, into H and OH. Manganese is responsible for water hydrolysis, so it doesn't matter how much chlorophyll you have, it doesn't matter how dark green the plants are. If you don't have enough manganese to split the water molecule, you have a bottleneck right there. And then the additional elements, I already mentioned nitrogen, and the 5th element that we would supply is phosphorus. Phosphorus is not directly involved in photosynthesis, but if you quadruple the number of sugars being produced in every 24-hour photoperiod, the plant has to be able to metabolize and move those sugars, and it needs phosphorus to do that in the form of ATP. Otherwise, you end up with an overload of sugars that the plant can't process. And then, particularly in the case of forages, I would also address sulfur, not so much for photosynthesis as for protein synthesis. So that's it. It's a relatively simple recipe. It's not that expensive. We've used this recipe, this formulation, the development of a couple of the products that we've developed. Our most popular products on the organic dairy farms that we work with in your area, Mike, are our organic forage foliar blend and photomag, which both have that combination, and they perform extremely well.
Do you formulate that per farm based on his soil samples, or where do you get your baseline to start when you start working with a farmer? What is your baseline?
So our baseline for these product formulations, for these products that we've developed, we've observed that 90% of the farms have the exact same profile, have the exact same problems for a given crop. So if you're growing forages, our forage foliar blend is going to fix 9 out of 10 potential problems that you might have. And then if we need to customize, if we specifically need to add a touch more zinc or add a touch more copper or something like that, we can add into that. But that basic blend of the forage foliar blend is going to cover pretty much everything that most of the farms need.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you would put that on as a foliar after every cutting?
The growers who are having the most success are trying to put that on every 30 days.
Okay.
And they like to see it after every cutting or after every grazing when they have 3 to 4 inches of regrowth to absorb it well and metabolize it well. And as consistent. The key is consistency. The more consistently you put it on, the more accumulative results you're going to get.
Now, I had an interesting observation last year on my own field, and I did foliar spray that. And what I was seeing, my neighbor wanted horse hay. So I'm like, well, we're going to just let the alfalfa go to mostly bloom instead of cutting it at 30 days. And at 32 days, no blooms. 34 days, no blooms. 36 days, a couple. And I cut it at 38 days, and it was not even 10% in bloom. Was that because of the nutrients I was adding that pushed that window out from trying to reproduce? Or what was the reason for that? Because the quality of the hay at 38 days was actually better than the previous cutting at 32 days.
Fascinating, isn't it? The answer is possibly yes. We have... this gets into another fascinating conversation, but the short answer is that with some nutrient applications, you can tremendously speed up the reproductive cycle, and with others, you can really slow it down. So I'm not sure exactly what it is that you were applying, but I can say with absolutely no question that on some of the crops that we work with, we deliberately wanted to take lettuce, for example. We do not want lettuce to bolt. We want it to stay vegetative. And we can manage the nutrition such that a lettuce head will not bolt easily at all, even in the most severe summer heat. Or we can make a lettuce head bolt in the spring when it's cool based on how we apply nutrition. So it is absolutely possible to slow down that nutrition, or slow down that reproduction on a forage crop and have it take a much longer period of time for it to fully reproduce. So I don't know exactly what you were applying, but the short answer is yes. It's very plausible that might work.
It was basically humates and a fish with a little bit of molasses in it was all it was. It would have been the third application for the year, one before at green up in the spring, after first, and then after third cutting, or second cutting. So this was the third cutting crop. But we did see the same thing on another farm where he cuts his hay religiously on 30 days, 29 or 30 days. And he said the last couple of years, he's been foliar spraying for about 5 years now. He's seeing that the quality, his window is much bigger as his hay crop is getting healthier. He's now pushed his cuttings out a couple days. He's gaining a lot of yield, and he's actually still gaining quality. Yep. But what he's doing, he's adding 10 days to his growing season for his 4 cuttings of hay.
Yep.
And his thinking is, well, everything is getting so much more vibrant and so much more healthy, where at 32 days, you don't all of a sudden come out and it's, all headed out and, not good anymore for dairy hay.
Almost always, when you increase a plant's quality and you increase the photosynthesis, that's going to result in a very different carbohydrate profile inside the plants. You're going to have much higher concentrations of pectins and cellulose, etc., very digestible carbohydrates. And without getting lost in the weeds of all the details, what I can say very simply is that you will not get this very rapid switch in any crop. You will not get this rapid switch from vibrant, vigorous, healthy to going downhill fast. And it will give you a much longer window. I mean, we have It's true of whether you're harvesting strawberries or tomatoes or whether you're making hay. You have a much greater window. We see that all the time.
Now, one thing that I'm just kind of observing as we're talking here is you're essentially doing what the biotechnology industry has tried to do through genetic manipulation through plant nutrition. That just hit me there. That's fascinating.
It's partially true. I mean, the reality is, from my perspective, we do not have a genetics problem in agriculture today. We have a nutritional problem. Now, certainly, we can constantly make improvements with genetics. We have come a long ways in genetics in many areas with many different crops. But we have also lost out on genetics with some crops. And in particular, I believe corn is one of the areas that we have lost genetic potential. Don Huber, a close friend and mentor of mine, indicated that in the 70s, on trial plots, they were harvesting 300 bushel per acre corn on trial plots when he was with Purdue. We've gone backwards in the genetic potential of corn because we have become so obsessed with specific traits, characteristics, and herbicide and pest resistance that we have been willing to sacrifice yields for genetic manipulation. So, from my perspective, we do not have a genetics problem. We have a nutrition problem. And when we fix and correct that nutritional problem, the problems that we are trying to fix with genetics are going to go away.
One couldn't happen without the other. There is a nutrition problem because of the genetic, you mentioned there's not a genetic problem, but because of the genetic manipulation that has led to a nutrition problem.
Yes, absolutely. They do feed on each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's wow.
Well, we can look at the pathway that we've gone down for the last 4 decades and kind of shake our heads and shrug our shoulders and wonder how we could have failed to see where that would lead. But at the same time, look at the tremendous opportunity that we have. We have the information and we have the knowledge today on how to radically reform our agricultural system. There's a great deal of hope and there's a great deal of opportunity. We just have to get off our rear ends and go do it.
Well, that does lead into something we definitely wanted to talk to you about, which is the future, where you see the future going. You know, this all sounds well and good, but not everybody is going to, hear you loud and clear right off the bat. So where do you see this going along with the current state of agriculture? Do you see that taking on some of these ideas, or is it going to continue to be resistant?
So, wow, that's a big question. So there's a couple of pieces. First of all, let me provide a bit of context for what my thoughts are and kind of the way I see the world shaping up at the moment, the agricultural world, if you will. So I'm of the persuasion that whenever you want to produce and you want to achieve radical change, tremendous change, a tsunami of change, not just gradual incremental change, you will never produce a tsunami of change by consumer demand. Consumer demand is not what led to the production of the iPhone. Consumer demand is not what led to the invention of the automobile. Consumer demand is not what led to the invention of GMO crops. Those were all driven by capital, by investment, by an economic equation, by the desire for capital to produce returns. So I believe that if we want to produce tremendous change, a sea shift of change in the agriculture space, then that is going to have to be driven by an economic equation where we can show growers and investors that they can be more profitable in the field using regenerative systems than they're using today. That is how you're going to produce a tremendous change. If you look at organics, there's some consumer demand for organics, but it's still single percentage point of the total food supply chain. The second thought is that in most cases, you produce a substantial shift in thinking when there is a very serious jolt to the system. There has to be a wake-up call. And when there is a wake-up call, then people really kind of sit up and take notice. And unfortunately, in many cases because they are forced to wake up and take notice. And that again, those can be economic drivers, they can be social drivers, there can be many different things that force that kind of universal jolt. But often when we have significant changes in policy, politics, or economics, it is a result of a substantial jolt. So with that being said, I really believe that over the course of the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, there is going to be tremendous change in the agriculture space in ways that we can't even fully imagine right now. And in particular, one of the areas that I feel quite confident there's going to be substantial change is with our crop production system and the crop mix of the crops that we are growing. I'll just point out two pieces. First, I've had conversations with a number of people in the grass-fed beef space who have pointed out two things. First of all, growing beef on prime grassland, a prime land in the Midwest, economically outperforms corn production right now and has for the last 4 years. So the rule of thumb is that a 100 bushel per acre yield potential on corn is the equivalent of 400 cow days of grazing per year. So if you use that equation and you look at prime corn production ground in Iowa or Illinois or in the Midwest, then it is possible to lease or rent that land, plant it into grass, purchase stocker cattle at auction price in the spring, graze them for the summer, sell them at auction price in the fall. I'm not talking no grass-fed premium, simply commodity price in, commodity price out, and you can economically outperform corn production. That's been true for 5 years. I believe that's going to continue to be true for a while. So that has the potential to drive a shift and change, but not nearly so much, I think, as this other piece, which is what is happening with energy. So this is really a topic that I personally am really fascinated by, is the future of energy and technology and how the world is rapidly evolving around us. But without just the highlights, the high-level overview, and there's dozens of references for this information. But the high-level overview is that by 2025, every single personal new automotive vehicle that is manufactured is going to be an electric vehicle. Every one, 100% is the prediction. That's 2025. That's 8 years away. And what that means, and that as those vehicles become deployed in ever greater percentages over the years into the fleet, then that is expected to have a hit on oil prices, where oil consumption is expected to fall by 10% right off the bat and going to continue to fall from that point forward. So what that means, and this is why the OPEC countries have been exporting oil as rapidly as they can. They've been dumping oil because they know that whatever they have a finite time window to get sold what they have in the ground. And there's going to be a point in the not too distant future where whatever they do not have sold is probably never going to be sold. And for the exact same reasons, there's been tremendous pressure on the oil companies here in North America to devalue their assets that they have counted as all the billions of barrels of oil that they still have in the ground. They are being asked to devalue those book assets. And so they are trying to move oil as quickly as they can. What all of this means is that for the foreseeable future, the oil prices should not be expected to jump up very radically unless there is some type of manipulation going on. Oil prices are going to remain low because everyone recognizes that they have a finite window. Well, what does that mean for ethanol? It means that the red ink on ethanol is going to continue to grow and grow until at some point the politicians in D.C. are no longer going to be willing to foot the bill for all the red ink. And when that happens, we don't know when that happens. It could happen next year. It could happen in 3 years or 5 years. But when that happens, 30% of the U.S. corn market disappears overnight. So when you think about where commodity corn prices are now, and where they would be if 30% disappeared, then I think that there is a very strong likelihood that the crop mix that is being grown in the country today is going to shift substantially away from corn. So that is one thing that I see happening as it is relevant to this conversation. And then there's going to be other pieces as well. Fruit and vegetable production, I see shifting away from the West Coast more towards the Midwest. The Midwest or the West Coast is losing several of its competitive advantages, particularly as we move more in the direction of having robotic harvesters and robotic machine harvesting for various crops. One of the big advantages that they have had historically is labor. That advantage is going to disappear. And so I think in general, the major piece that I would advise growers today is whatever you do, if you are a smaller scale farmer, don't try to compete with the commodity growers. If everybody else is growing corn and soybeans and wheat, the last 3 crops you should be growing is corn and soybeans and wheat. You can do better with almost anything else. Grow dry beans, grow popcorn, grow food grade corn, grow organic corn. Somehow you need to differentiate yourself so that you're not producing a commodity.
Because I think that's the one advantage that organic dairy has. You're not playing on the same field as the mega dairies. And because a 50 cow, a 100 cow, a 300 cow dairy cannot compete with a 10,000 cow dairy. The efficiencies that they have, their goal is 1.5 million pounds per employee. Okay, and our average farm probably doesn't ship over 600,000 pounds a year. Okay, and that's with the whole family involved. So you have to play a different game because you'll just get run over.
Absolutely.
It's like me trying to play for the Browns.
Well, and so far, that's exactly where I was going to go. Is organic has been one of those opportunities to get out of the commodity game. Do you see organic becoming more and more like a commodity? And is there going to be a new opportunity that comes up, whether it's grass-fed, whether it's I don't know. I don't know what else is out there, but I definitely see we see more and more of these large-scale growers that are going organic because they're big in our minds. They're not big in the general. They're only farming 1,000 acres, not 10,000 acres. Do you see that changing? Do you see a shift there, or is that a long ways off?
Well, I definitely do expect that many more of these mid-scale growers are going to look very seriously at value adding. And so value adding can be, it can be food grade crops. It can be organic crops. It can be going for specific quality components, for example. So, but I do see a strong trend towards them, towards growers seeking to differentiate themselves from the commodity market. Now, what does that mean to part of your question? Do I think that organics are going to grow to become mainstream to a much larger proportion of the marketplace? It's possible. We don't know exactly how it's going to shape out, but if I had to guess, I would say that the opposite is going to happen, actually, that the mainstream is going to move in the direction to the point where they're very, very similar to organics. And my reason for saying that is just based on observation of what has happened in Europe as a result of the regulatory climate there. Today, every year, systematically for the last decade or so, possibly longer, they have failed to renew the use of a certain number of active ingredients, of pesticides, to the point where today there is such a very, very short list of pesticides that growers can use that if they continue, there is already many similarities and very few differences between mainstream production and organic production in much of Europe. And the difference keeps growing narrower and narrower and narrower every year, to the point where if they continue on the trajectory that they're on, in another 3 to 5 years from now, there will be no practical difference between mainstream production and organic production in Europe. And there is no substantial price difference at this point either. So of course, that is dependent on the regulatory climate that exists there, which is very different from the regulatory climate here in North America. But I would expect as well, as technologies are released into the marketplace, which are already being developed, that give consumers the capacity to measure the pesticide contamination in the food that they're buying in real time with parts per billion accuracy, I would suspect that the availability of that and accessibility of that technology would also drive regulatory change here to the point where in 10 to 15 years from now, there might not be much of a difference between organic and mainstream.
Now, that sounds great on one side, that there's the opportunity for more nutritious food on the market. But then I'm looking at it from the farmer side. Does that mean that as, say, current conventional agriculture potentially becomes more and more like organic, that the pricing on organic has to come down to come in line with current conventional pricing, or is conventional going to have to find a way to come up?
I think there is going to be, my perception would be that there's going to be a coming together somewhere in the middle. Because commodity prices, when we talk about commodity prices, I mean, there is a floor on prices of crops that are truly grown as food that is related to the cost of production. Now, there is no floor like that on corn production. And I may sound quite aggressive here, but the reality is, who do you know that eats corn? Who do you know that eats soybeans? People don't eat corn. People don't eat soybeans. And yes, we may say that we eat them and consume them indirectly in the form of livestock feed, etc. That is certainly partially true. But if you really want to be successful as a grower in the long term, the farther you can distance yourself from that commodity grain, the more successful you're going to be. If you take dry beans versus soybeans, for example, there is a price floor on dry beans that is related to the cost of production. That doesn't exist. And the reason it exists is because if the price drops below a certain point, growers don't plant dry beans. The acreage is small enough that there is a very close correlation between supply and demand. And that same holds true whether you're growing food-grade corn, whether you're growing popcorn, whether you're growing spelt for human consumption. I mean, there's so many different grains and so many different opportunities that they're not on the commodity marketplace. You have to disassociate yourself from anything that gets traded on the Chicago Board of Trade. Anything that's there, you don't want to grow.
There's a local conventional grain farmer that dropped a lot of corn out of his rotations and does a lot more barley. He said he makes more money per acre on barley than beans or corn, because he said he's got a market for the straw. He said it's an easy crop to grow. And he said with where the corn prices are just keep dropping and dropping, he said he did really well on his barley the last 3 years. So he's been upping his acres of barley every year.
Absolutely.
Because barley's good feed. Now, when you did say that, who do you know that eats corn or soybeans? Well, pretty much everything you buy at a store has got corn syrup in it now. So indirectly,
Yes, indirectly. And I understand that. But again, going back to the regulatory climate and the... Again, I don't think that huge demand shift is going to be created by, or huge shift in what is on the grocery store shelf is going to be created by consumer demand. But I do think that as certain segments of the population, doctors, healthcare professionals, etc., become more closely aware of the impacts of some of these things are happening on the health of the human population as a whole. I mean, right now, our state of sickness in North America is quite dismal, and it's because of all the processed food and all the junk that is in our food. And it's, I would say it seems to be a reasonable probability that the quality of our processed foods are going to go up dramatically in the next 10 to 15 years, and part of that is going to include the reduction of soybean oil and high fructose corn syrup and all the other goodies.
Well, and I think, corn syrup, take corn syrup as an example, wasn't part of the development of corn syrup because there was so much corn out there.
Yep.
So, yeah, it wasn't an economic shift of people saying, hey, we want corn syrup. It was, hey, we have an economic incentive to move this corn, and let's figure out a way to process it or whatever we have to do, and we'll find a way to put it in people's food.
And then, of course, we just grow more.
That's right.
If it's good, let's all grow it, right? You know, it's easy to see when you're traveling how many cities you see cranes sitting at the hospital. They're always expanding. Mm-hmm. I mean, if that doesn't show what's happening with the health of our country, mm-hmm. I mean, it's so evident. You know, the big construction in a lot of cities is that. And it's really, really sad to see.
So just one more thought on crop diversity and growing crops. There are so many crops that we used to grow in different parts of the country that we don't grow anymore. Prior to, I may get my dates confused now, but I want to say prior to 1967 or 69, Iowa was the 6th state in the nation for apple production. They were 4th or 5th for potato production. They were 2nd or 3rd for flax production. And today, not one of those 3 crops is being grown in any significant acreage in the state of Iowa. So there, if we look at the fruit and vegetable production world, one that I'm familiar with personally, the United States, I'm talking specifically about fresh, not processed, not frozen, but fresh fruits and vegetables. The United States imports 45% of the fresh fruits and vegetables that are consumed in this country. And of that remaining 55% of the remaining, 70% of that number is grown in California. So California has had rainfall this last winter now, and they have enough water to last for a year or two, but the underground water reservoirs have not been replenished at this point. California is still in a drought, even though they don't want to talk about it. But what is going to happen when California is no longer able to supply the fruit and vegetable production of this country and all the export markets that they have? The reality is that in the very near future, there is going to be tremendous demand for fruit and vegetable production that is produced here in the Midwest. And there is absolutely no reason why we can't do it. We have an appropriate climate. We have good soils. We can produce really great fruit and vegetable crops here in the Midwest, and we are substantially closer to the East Coast markets than California, which gives us a competitive advantage in freight.
Mm-hmm. And you are seeing on a lot of smaller farms, you're seeing more and more, they'll put a couple acres in vegetables, and then all of a sudden next year that grows and grows, and all of a sudden, they're raising 10 to 20 acres of vegetables. You see in that more and more, just trying to value add to their farm.
Well, and that is one pathway for the family scale farms, and I absolutely respect that. But I also believe that if we truly want to have a conversation about moving fruit and vegetable production from California to the Midwest, it can't just happen on a scale of 10 and 20 acre
mm-hmm.
lots. We need it to happen on scales of hundreds of acres of farms, and there are a relatively small number of farms here in the Midwest who are doing that, but of those that I know, many of them are extremely successful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the fruit and vegetable market, is it going to follow, I guess I've seen it on the poultry side. Eggs and meat birds are moving. There are a lot of barns going up. I'm familiar with northern Indiana. There are a lot of barns going up in northern Indiana and Michigan. And that came along with California not being able to produce cage-free eggs or move fast enough in that direction. So do you kind of see the same? It sounds like you're saying that the same kind of shift is going to happen with probably more than just fruits and vegetables and poultry birds. But
it absolutely could happen with dairy in California. Yep. It could happen with anything that is very severely water dependent. The This may sound harsh to say this, but based on observation of the political climate and what I have observed happening in California over the last half a dozen years, is when California runs out of water, it is literally going to be like falling off a cliff, because there is very little advanced preparation. Everyone is flying it on a wing and a prayer and hoping things work out at the last minute. And they have so far. But there is going to come a day when that will no longer work.
Well, John, is there anything else you'd like to touch on yet?
There is one thought that comes to mind. Over the last 10 years, every year at the end of the growing season, we have evaluated the success of all of our growers and asked the question about how much opportunity they have left on the table. How good did their crops perform against the potential we believed that they had to perform? And we would rank our growers on a scale of 1 to 10, and then group the 1s and 2s together, group the 9s and 10s together, and look at what were the commonalities within each of these groups and what were the big differences between the two groups. And we've learned a lot about agronomy and about farm management by doing this exercise every year with the same pool of farmers. In the last number of years, what we have seen emerge from doing this very intense analysis has had nothing to do with agronomy or plant nutrition. It has had everything to do with farm management. And we've identified a list of 16 specific characteristics that the group of 9s and 10s, this group of farm managers that performs extremely well, they have this group of characteristics that the 1s and 2s do not display consistently at all. But of those 16, many of them fall under their details under two big umbrella pieces that I think are very important. The first piece is in terms of the left brain linear analytical process of farming, and particularly as it relates to economics and finance, the most successful farm managers in terms of how they prioritize their time, how they prioritize their own learning and thinking, they spend 80% of their energy and time and resources thinking about and learning about how to increase revenue, and 20% on how to reduce costs. The less successful farm managers do the exact opposite. They spend 80% of their time thinking about how to reduce costs and only 20% about how to increase revenue. The second major umbrella characteristic is on the more intuitive, heart-connected side. As you know, a good dairy farmer can walk out into the barn in the morning and walk down an aisle between two rows of cows that have their backs turned to him, and he can say, there is something wrong with that cow, and there is absolutely no visual indicator that there is anything wrong. It is purely gut. It's an intuitive reaction. That connection, that type of sympathetic connection, that intuitive connection to their livestock and to the crops that they're growing is a common characteristic of all of the most successful farm managers that is completely missing on the less successful farm managers. They will have this with their crops. You can walk through an orchard, you can walk through a field, and they say, there is something wrong with this field. They don't know what it is. They're not able to describe what's going on, but they just feel it. They know that not everything is quite right. Those farmers who actively cultivate that and who talk about it, they try to improve it and constantly do a better job of having that heart connection and that heart communication with what is going on around them, are consistently the top performing farm managers. And I think this is something that historically we have failed to appreciate in agriculture, is we have focused on being very left brain, linear, logical. It's been a very male-oriented approach, is you hammer something into place, and if it's not effective, you get a bigger hammer. You use more brute force. And this more softer, more intuitive approach is something that I think we will need to do collectively, need to do a much better job of cultivating to become better farmers. So that's all that I have. Thank you for having me on.
Yes. And if somebody's listening to this and wants to get a hold of your company, how would they find your company?
They can find us online. Our website is advancingecoag.com, and our phone number to contact us is 800-495-6603.
Okay. Well, John, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Found it very interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks to both of you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen.